Who are you? How did you get on my bed?
Think about the last time you felt completely safe inside your own home. You locked the front door. You turned off the lights. You trusted the people around you. And you went to sleep. That feeling of safety, that deep, quiet certainty that everything is fine and everyone you've let close to you deserves to be there. That is the most dangerous feeling in the world. Not because your home isn't safe, but because sometimes the person you trusted to protect it is already planning your destruction from the inside. David Mercer woke up on an ordinary Tuesday morning in October, and the first thing he noticed was that the sheets on his side of the bed were tangled around his legs in a way that didn't feel like his own restless sleep. The second thing he noticed was that someone was beside him, a young woman, one he did not fully recognize in that first disoriented moment of consciousness. The room was dark, the house was quiet, and somewhere in that house, footage of the previous night had already been saved to a device he didn't know existed. He sat up slowly. His head was heavy, heavier than a man who'd simply had a bad night's sleep. His mouth was dry. His memory of the evening before was fractured, incomplete, like a photograph that had been torn and imperfectly reassembled. He remembered his dinner. He remembered sitting in the living room. He remembered his drink. And then, nothing. A wall. A complete and total blackout that no amount of concentration could push through. He didn't know what had happened. He couldn't explain it. But the evidence in front of him, the woman, the bed, the disorientation, suggested something had. What David didn't know yet, in those first terrifying minutes of that morning, was that nothing had happened. Not in the way it looked. Not in the way it was designed to look. Because that was the entire point. The scene had been constructed, staged, directed, and the director of it had been living in his house for years, cooking his meals, watching his children, folding his family's laundry, trusted so completely by his wife, Claire, that her name was never once associated with suspicion. Her name was Agnes. And what Agnes had set in motion that night was not an accident, not a crime of passion, and not a single isolated act of desperation. It was a trap. And David Mercer had walked straight into it. Before we go any further into this story, I need you to hold on to two questions. The first question is, how do you drug a man, film him unconscious in his own bed beside a woman he's never touched, and then use that footage to convince the world, and almost a court of law, that he was responsible for what happened? How do you engineer that level of deception inside a family's most private space? The second question is, how do you pull off that kind of scheme? Collect money from your victim for months, and then have the audacity to walk back through his front door, stand in front of his wife, and accuse that same man of rape, not in private, not in a quiet threat, in an official legal demand, with a lawyer's letter, with your daughter beside you, ready to testify? How do you look a woman in the eye? A woman who welcomed you into her home, who paid your salary, who trusted you around her children, and make that accusation knowing every detail of it was manufactured. And before we go any deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Claire Mercer was not the kind of woman who coasted. She had built her professional life from the ground up, starting in her mid-20s with nothing more than determination, a sharp mind, and the willingness to outwork everyone in the room. By the time she was in her early 40s, she was running a mid-sized logistics consulting firm that she had grown from a 3-person operation into something with over 40 employees, a client list that stretched across 4 states, and a reputation in her industry for being someone who delivered results and didn't make excuses. She traveled regularly, sometimes for weeks at a stretch, and she had made peace with the fact that building the life she wanted required sacrifice. She and David had talked about this. It was a partnership. She brought the ambition. He held the home together. David Mercer was the quieter of the two, but not in a diminished way. He was a high school history teacher, a career he had chosen deliberately and never regretted, despite the salary gap between his work and his wife's. He loved what he did. He was the kind of teacher students remembered years later, the kind who actually read the papers he assigned and wrote notes in the margins. At home, he handled the routines with the same steadiness he brought to a classroom. He picked up the kids, managed the house, paid the bills, kept things moving. When Claire was traveling, he was the fixed point around which everything else rotated. Their marriage was not perfect. No marriage is. But it was real, and it was built on something solid, or so they both believed. They hired Agnes Johnson about 4 years before any of this happened. She came with references, 2 families who spoke well of her, a clean background, a warm manner. She was in her early 50s, experienced with children, reliable with schedules. Claire liked her immediately. There was something about Agnes that communicated steadiness, a kind of unflappable competence that made Claire feel less guilty about her travel schedule. Agnes knew the house within weeks. She knew where everything was, how the kids liked their lunches, what time David came home, which neighbors stopped by, and when. She learned the rhythms of that family the way water learns the shape of a container. Quietly, completely, without anyone noticing how thoroughly she'd filled every corner. The daughter, Mia Johnson, entered the picture about 6 months before the incident. Agnes introduced her to the household gradually, the way you'd introduce a new ingredient, a little at a time, just enough to normalize the presence before the full flavor arrived. She came to help on busy days, Agnes said. She was a good girl, Agnes said. She needed work and could be trusted. Claire had met Mia twice, maybe 3 times. She seemed quiet, polite, helpful. There was nothing about her that raised a flag. And that, too, was by design. By the time Mia was needed for what Agnes had planned, her presence in the house was already unremarkable. Nobody questioned why she was there. She was just Agnes's daughter, helping out. There was a third person involved in this. Someone the family never knew, never saw, never had any reason to suspect existed. He had been brought in by Agnes well before the night of the incident. Let's call him Marcus. He was a man with a camera and a willingness to do what he was paid to do, as long as the payment was right. Agnes had met him through a mutual contact and laid out the arrangement in straightforward terms. He would film what happened on a specific night. He would hand the footage over, and he would receive a cut of whatever money the scheme produced. He agreed. He cased the property twice in the weeks leading up to the operation, identifying the side entrance Agnes would leave unlocked, and the angles he would need to capture what she intended to capture. He was professional about it. That was the problem. He was too professional to be paid as an afterthought. Looking back, and this is always where the hindsight becomes excruciating, there were things the family could have noticed. Agnes had begun asking questions about Claire's travel schedule with a frequency that went slightly beyond normal household logistics. Not questions that were obviously invasive, but questions that, in retrospect, were building a map of opportunity. She had started referencing Mia more regularly in conversation, making sure the name was comfortable in everyone's mouths. And a neighbor, one who never thought to mention it until months later, had seen a man sitting in a parked car on their street 3 evenings in a row, looking at the Mercer house. None of these things were connected at the time. They were just background noise. Life is full of background noise, and most of it means nothing. But sometimes, the noise is a signal. Claire left for her business trip on a Thursday afternoon. It was a routine departure, an overnight bag, a cab to the airport, a quick call to David from the gate to confirm the kids' weekend schedule. She didn't think twice about leaving. She had done it dozens of times. Agnes was there. The house was covered. Everything was fine. What Claire didn't know, as her plane lifted off, was that Agnes had already confirmed the timeline to both Mia and Marcus. She had been waiting for this specific trip. A 4-day absence, confirmed 2 weeks in advance, and every piece of the plan had been set in place around it. The moment Claire's cab pulled out of the driveway, the clock was already running. That evening, David came home from school at his usual time, around 4:30. Agnes was in the kitchen. Dinner was already being prepared. She had been home all day. The kids were picked up, fed, and settled into their evening routines. By 8 o'clock, the house was calm. By 9, the children were in bed. David sat in the living room, grading papers. Agnes brought him a glass of water and a small plate of food, the same way she often did on evenings when Claire was away. A small gesture of care that he had always appreciated without thinking much about. He thanked her. He drank the water. He continued working. Within 40 minutes, the pages in his hands had become difficult to focus on. His eyes were heavy in a way that felt different from ordinary tiredness. Deeper, heavier, like being pulled downward rather than simply worn out. He assumed he was more exhausted than he'd realized. He moved to the bedroom. He lay down. And that was the last thing he was fully conscious of until morning. Agnes moved quickly once she was certain David was incapacitated. She confirmed it. She went to the bedroom and checked, and then she made the call. Mia was waiting nearby. She arrived within 20 minutes, carrying a bag. Marcus arrived at the side entrance 10 minutes after that. Let in through the door, Agnes had unlocked earlier in the day. He set up his equipment efficiently. He had clearly done this kind of work before, or something close to it. The room was arranged. Mia did what she had been told to do. She undressed. She positioned herself beside David, who was unconscious and completely unresponsive. Marcus filmed. The footage lasted approximately 40 minutes. Long enough, detailed enough, and staged carefully enough that, without knowing the context, a viewer would struggle to now understand that the man in the bed had been chemically sedated and had no awareness of anything happening around him. David never touched Mia. He could not have. The sedative Agnes had administered was strong enough to incapacitate a grown man for hours. There was no physical contact. There was no assault. There was, however, a very convincing recording that told a story Agnes intended to tell. When Marcus had what he needed, he packed his equipment and left through the same side door. Mia dressed and left through the front. Agnes locked up behind them, returned to her room, and went to sleep. The next morning, she made David breakfast as though nothing had happened, watched him wake up confused and disoriented, and said nothing. She waited. She had learned patience. She understood that the moment of leverage was not the morning after. It was the moment the footage was in front of David's eyes. The call came 2 days later. Agnes used a number David didn't recognize, a prepaid phone, untraceable to her name. Her voice was altered slightly, enough to create distance from the woman he saw every day. But the content of the message was clear. She told him there was footage. She described details of the recording that only someone who had been in that room could know. She told him what his wife would think when she saw it. She told him what his colleagues would think. She told him what his children would eventually understand when they were older. And then she told him the number. The first demand was $8,000. He had 72 hours. If he didn't pay, the footage would be sent to Claire's phone, to his school's administration, and posted publicly online. David Mercer sat alone with that phone call for a very long time. He tried to reason through what had happened, tried to reconstruct the evening, tried to understand how the woman he had not, to his knowledge, touched had ended up in that recording. He couldn't piece it together. His memory was a wall. He didn't know about the sedative, not yet. All he knew was that the footage existed, that it would be devastating regardless of the truth, and that the person on the other end of that call knew enough to make the threat credible. He paid the $8,000. He told himself it would end there. He transferred the money through a platform that Agnes had specified, one that created enough distance to slow a paper trail. And he waited for confirmation that the footage would be destroyed. The confirmation came. The footage was not destroyed. The next demand arrived 3 weeks later. For the next several months, the demands kept coming, irregular enough to prevent David from developing a strategy around them, large enough to create real financial strain, and accompanied each time by just enough new detail to remind him that the threat was real and ongoing. He borrowed money to cover some of the payments, using explanations to Claire that weren't entirely lies, but weren't the truth either. A bad investment, an unexpected repair, a tax issue. He was carrying the weight of something he didn't fully understand, in a body that had been violated without his knowledge, while continuing to teach school every day and be a father every evening. The emotional damage of that period, the shame, the confusion, the isolation, is difficult to overstate. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he was behaving exactly the way the script had intended, paying, staying quiet, and falling apart. There is a limit to how long a person can carry a secret of that magnitude before it begins to change them in ways the people closest to them can see. Claire noticed the changes in David before she understood what they meant. He was sleeping poorly. He was distracted in conversations, present in body, but somewhere else entirely in his mind. He had become guarded in a way that was foreign to their relationship, choosing words more carefully than he ever had, deflecting questions that used to invite easy answers. She asked him more than once if something was wrong. He told her he was fine. She did not fully believe him, but didn't yet know how to push through the wall he'd built. She was giving him space she wasn't sure he needed. The breaking point came on a Sunday evening in March, roughly 6 months after the incident. Claire was home from a trip. The kids were asleep. David sat across from her at the kitchen table, and he told her, not everything, not in a clean, organized narrative, but in pieces, the way you tell someone something that has been locked inside you for too long. He told her he had woken up, and there was a woman in the bed. He told her he didn't know how it had happened. He told her about the call, the demand, the payments. He told her he had been paying someone for months, and that the footage existed, and that he did not know what was in it because he had never seen it. He told her he was terrified of what she would think. And then he stopped talking and waited for her to respond. Claire Mercer sat with that information for a long moment. She would say later that there was a part of her, a very human, very understandable part, that felt the pull of the obvious interpretation. A woman in his bed, money transfers he had hidden, a story about a phone call she had never heard about. The narrative that would have been easier to believe was the one that cast David as guilty of something. But Claire was not a woman who made decisions on the first interpretation. She was, professionally and personally, someone who looked for evidence before she drew conclusions, and something in the specific details of what David was describing. The total memory blackout, the disorientation, the nature of the call, the amounts, the timing, didn't match the profile of a guilty man covering something up. It matched something else entirely. She told him she believed him. And then she went to work. The first thing Claire did was arrange for David to be seen by a physician she trusted, someone outside their regular network, to whom she explained, in careful terms, what David had described. A blood panel was ordered. At 6 months out, the direct chemical evidence of what had been administered was long gone from David's system. Sedatives of the type that were later identified don't persist that long. But the physician made a clinical notation that David's described experience, the specific quality and duration of the blackout, the post-event disorientation, the physical heaviness, was consistent with the administration of a benzodiazepine compound at a dose above therapeutic range. That notation would later become part of the legal record. It wasn't a confession, but it was a footprint. The second thing Claire did was pull the security footage. Their home had cameras, a standard installation, the kind most suburban families have without thinking much about it, covering the front entrance, the driveway, and the side of the house. She had never had reason to review the footage before. She sat down with the recordings from the night in question, and she went through them frame by frame. What she found was not subtle. At 11:42 p.m., Mia Johnson appeared at the front door, carrying a large bag over her shoulder. Agnes opened the door from inside. She had clearly been waiting. At 11:53 p.m., a man appeared at the side of the house, carrying what appeared to be a bag of equipment, entering through the side door that Agnes routinely kept locked. That man was Marcus. He was on camera for 14 seconds. It was enough. Claire printed the relevant frames. She cross-referenced them with the dates of the financial transfers David had made. She mapped the timeline of Agnes's questions about her travel schedule against the specific trip that had been exploited. She built a picture, quietly, methodically, without alerting Agnes, who was still reporting to work every day, as though nothing had happened. The discipline it took to sit across from Agnes during those weeks of investigation, to maintain the normal rhythms of the household, to give no indication that anything had shifted. Claire would later describe that period as one of the hardest things she had ever done. She was building a case. She could not afford to show her hand before it was complete. But there was a moment every morning when Agnes arrived, and Claire had to find a way to look at her face without letting everything she now knew cross her own. The financial records told their own story. David had been meticulous, almost compulsively so, a habit from years of managing household finances. And the transfers were documented in a way that, while they had been structured to obscure their purpose, showed a clear and repeated pattern. Same platform, similar amounts, irregular intervals, no corresponding purchase or service attached to any of them. A forensic accountant, brought in quietly through a contact of Claire's, reviewed the records and identified the pattern immediately. She described it in her report as consistent with recurring extortion payments. That word, extortion, appeared in a document for the first time, and once it was there in writing, the shape of everything Agnes had done became legally legible. What Claire didn't yet know, what none of them knew, was that Agnes wasn't finished. She had collected significant money over those months. She had seemingly gotten away with it. David had been paying without going to the police, without involving anyone outside the family, without pushing back in any meaningful way. From Agnes's perspective, the plan had worked better than I have hoped, and that success, it appears, made her feel invincible. Because invincibility, in situations like this one, is always what undoes the people who believe they've found it. Agnes began planning her next move, and her next move was the one that would destroy everything she had built. It had been several months since Claire had come home from the trip that changed everything. The house had returned to something resembling its former rhythm, but it was a performance of normalcy rather than the real thing. Claire knew what she knew. David knew she knew. And Agnes moved through the house like a woman who believed she was still holding all the cards. Claire had been deliberate about this. She wanted the evidence complete before anything was confronted. She wanted no gaps, no ambiguity, nothing that could be argued away in a courtroom. So the household continued. And then, on an otherwise unremarkable Wednesday afternoon, the doorbell rang. Agnes was standing on the front porch. Beside her was Mia. They were dressed formally, not in the casual clothing of a household employee and her daughter stopping by, but in the composed, deliberate attire of people who had rehearsed this moment. Agnes was holding a document. She handed it to Claire with the expression of someone performing a role they had prepared for carefully. Solemn, righteous, resolved. The document was a formal legal demand, prepared by an attorney, alleging that David Mercer had sexually assaulted Mia Johnson inside the family home. It demanded a specific financial settlement. It stated if the demand was not met within 30 days, the matter would be referred to law enforcement and pursued through the courts. The demand was not small. It was the kind of number that was designed to be taken seriously. Large enough to constitute real consequence, not so large as to seem immediately absurd. Claire read the document on her own porch, in front of the two women who had orchestrated everything David had suffered for the better part of a year. She read it carefully, not skimming, not reacting, reading. Agnes watched her. Mia looked at the ground. Claire lowered the document when she was finished, looked at both of them, and said, with a steadiness that she would later admit required every bit of discipline she had, that she would need time to review it with her attorney. Agnes nodded. Mia said nothing. They left. Claire closed the front door, leaned against it, and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of the emotion she had been holding back. Then she picked up her phone and made 2 calls. The first was to her attorney. The second was to the detective she had already been in contact with during her months of private investigation. The audacity of what Agnes and Mia had just done. Standing on the porch of the home they had violated, making a formal legal accusation against the man they had drugged and filmed and blackmailed, was, to everyone who later became involved in the case, one of the most striking elements of the entire story. Not because criminal boldness is uncommon, it isn't, but because of the specific calculation it revealed. Agnes had apparently assessed, based on David's months of silence and payment, that the family was too afraid and too compromised to fight back. She had mistaken David's fear for permanent compliance. She had not accounted for what Claire Mercer was capable of once she understood the full picture. And she had not, apparently, given any thought to the one person in the arrangement who was quietly growing dissatisfied. The man with the camera. Marcus had not been paid what he'd been promised. That was the simple, unglamorous truth at the center of everything that unraveled next. He had filmed what Agnes asked him to film. He had provided the footage. He had maintained his silence through the months of blackmail payments, understanding that his role in the scheme made him legally exposed, and that his best protection was continuing to be useful. But Agnes had been paying him in portions. A little here, a little there, always with a promise of more once the next demand was paid. And the more that was paid, the clearer it became to Marcus that the proportions were shifting in a direction that was not favorable to him. He had taken on real legal risk for what was becoming, from his perspective, a very inequitable share of the returns. When law enforcement paid contact with Marcus, located through the 14 seconds of security footage Claire had preserved, cross-referenced with a partial license plate a neighbor had happened to note on one of the evenings he'd surveilled the property, he did not take long to make a decision. His attorney advised him that cooperation was his most viable path, and Marcus, who had not been paid enough to feel any particular loyalty to Agnes or to Mia, agreed. What he provided was comprehensive. He described the planning conversations with Agnes in detail. Conversations in which she had laid out the entire scheme, including which drug to use, how to administer it, what role Mia would play, and how the footage would be used for blackmail. He described the night of the filming in specific terms. He described the payments he'd received. He handed over every communication between himself and Agnes that he had kept. Text messages, voice notes, a recorded call from months prior in which Agnes had discussed the extortion strategy with a clarity that left almost no interpretive room. The text messages between Agnes and Mia, recovered from both of their phones following their arrest, were equally unambiguous. They had discussed the plan in writing, casually, almost carelessly, in a way that suggested neither of them had seriously entertained the possibility that their phones would ever be examined. There were messages about timing, about what Mia should wear, about how the footage should be described to David in the initial call. There were messages about the financial demands, how much to ask for, when to escalate, when to threaten. And there was a specific exchange, dated 3 weeks before Agnes appeared on the porch with the legal demand letter, in which the two of them discussed adding the rape accusation as a secondary strategy. Agnes's words, as recorded in the messages, were explicit about the fact that it was an accusation they intended to manufacture. The medical evidence, reviewed formally in the context of the now official investigation, confirmed what Claire's physician had documented months earlier. The timeline of David's described incapacitation was consistent with a sedative compound administered in a drink. The footage itself, obtained through the legal process, once Marcus handed over copies, showed clearly to any medical professional reviewing it that David Mercer was unconscious throughout. There was no physical contact between him and Mia. The staging was evident once you understood what you were looking at. The rape accusation was not only false, it was the single most reckless decision Agnes made in the entire scheme, because it forced a formal legal investigation into circumstances that, without it, might have stayed buried in David's shame and silence for far longer. Agnes Johnson was arrested on charges including conspiracy, extortion, administration of a noxious substance, and making a false accusation. Mia Johnson was arrested on related charges, including conspiracy and filing a false report. Marcus cooperated fully with the prosecution and faced his own charges, mitigated by his cooperation agreement. The attorney who had drafted the legal demand letter, it emerged, had been provided with a fabricated account by Agnes and had acted in good faith. He was not implicated in the criminal conspiracy, though the demand letter itself became a key piece of evidence. The financial records of every payment David had made were entered into the legal record. The security footage was entered into the legal record. The phone records, the text messages, the medical documentation, the testimony of the neighbor who had seen Marcus's car, all of it was entered into the legal record. Agnes had planned carefully. She had not planned carefully enough. There is something particular about the aftermath of a case like this one. something that the legal resolution, however satisfying, doesn't entirely address. Agnes Johnson had not been a stranger who forced her way into the Mercer household. She had been welcomed. She had been trusted. She had been given access not just to the physical space of that family's home, but to its rhythms, its vulnerabilities, its private architecture. 4 years of proximity, 4 years of meals and school pickups and weekend routines. She had used every piece of that access as intelligence. The thing that made her scheme possible was not cleverness. Schemes like this one are more common than people want to believe. And the mechanics of it were not particularly sophisticated. What made it possible was trust. The Mercers' trust. And the terrifying thing about trust is that it is, by its nature, something you cannot extend with conditions attached. The moment you start examining it, you've already lost it. For Claire and David Mercer, the legal outcome brought justice in the formal sense of the word. Agnes and Mia were convicted. Sentences were handed down. The financial restitution order that accompanied the conviction didn't come close to covering what the family had lost. Not just in money, but in the particular kind of innocence you have before you've experienced a betrayal of that magnitude from someone that close. David spoke publicly about the experience once, in a brief statement after the verdict. He said the hardest part had not been the blackmail, and it had not been the fear. It had been the shame he'd felt for something he hadn't done, the way the scheme had been designed to make him feel guilty and alone and unable to ask anyone for help. He said he hoped that other people in similar situations, people being blackmailed, people who had been drugged and filmed without their knowledge, would understand that the shame was manufactured. It was a weapon, and like every weapon, it could be disarmed. What happened to Marcus is a different kind of ending. He served a reduced sentence as part of his cooperation agreement. He was not present for any of the sentencing proceedings for Agnes or Mia. He has, as far as anyone involved in the case is aware, not had any further contact with the Mercer family. He is, in many ways, the most uncomfortably human figure in this story. A person who made a choice to participate in something deeply wrong, not out of personal hatred for the Mercers or any ideological conviction, but simply because he was offered money, and it seemed low risk at the time. That calculation, I'll do this because the money looks good, and I don't think I'll get caught, is not a rare calculation. It's a very ordinary one. And it's the kind of calculation that, when it goes wrong, tends to take everything down with it. There is a question that sits underneath all of this, and it doesn't have a clean answer. It's not a legal question. The law answered the legal questions. It's a human question. It's the one Claire reportedly asked herself in the weeks after the verdict, lying awake in the house that she had fought so hard to protect. How do you know? How do you know who to trust when the people who mean you the most harm are the ones who are best at appearing trustworthy? How do you build a life, a real life, with a home and children and a career, and all the things that make you vulnerable, when the very openness that makes that life possible is also what makes it exploitable? There is no system that fully solves that problem. There is no background check that reveals what a person is planning. There is no way to live fully and be fully protected at the same time. That tension is just the price of being human and trusting other humans. Most of the time, the people you trust don't betray you. But sometimes they do. And the only thing that saves you when it happens is exactly what saved the Mercers. Someone telling the truth, even if it's only because they weren't paid enough not to. The Mercer family rebuilt. It took time, more time than any verdict can account for. But they rebuilt. Claire has spoken about what the experience changed in her. And it was not, Scheisse says, her capacity to trust. It was her capacity to act, to follow the evidence rather than the fear, to believe that the truth is worth the cost of finding it, even when finding it is the hardest thing you'll ever do. David is still teaching. He still grades papers with notes in the margins. Their kids grew up knowing what their parents survived together and what that survival required. That is not a small thing. That is, if anything, the only genuinely good thing that came out of any of this. So here is the question I want to leave you with, the one I want you to take into the comments, because I genuinely want to know what you think. At what point in this story did Agnes stop being someone you could have spotted? Was it when she started mapping Claire's travel schedule? Was it when she introduced Mia to the household? Was it earlier than that? Something in her manner, her questions, the way she made herself indispensable. Or do you think that, in the same position as the Mercers, you wouldn't have seen it coming either? There's no judgment in that question. The Mercers were not naive people. They were careful, intelligent, experienced adults who did what virtually everyone does when they let someone into their home. They trusted them. And now I want to know, where are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments and hit the subscribe button, because the next story we're covering is one that will test your instincts all over again. I'll see you there.